The MV Joyita was a merchant vessel from which 25 passengers and crew mysteriously disappeared in the South Pacific in 1955. It was found adrift in the South Pacific without its crew on board, and the ship was in very poor condition, including corroded pipes and a radio wall functional. Only had a range of about 2 miles due to faulty wiring. And despite this, the extreme buoyancy of the ship made sinking it nearly impossible. Investigators were puzzled as to why the crew did not remain on board and wait for help. The boat had been scheduled to leave on the noon tide the previous day, but her departure was delayed because her port engine clutch failed, and the Joyita eventually left Samoa on one engine. She was carrying 16 crew members and 9 passengers, including a government official, a doctor, a copra buyer, 2 children, and her cargo consisted of medical supplies, timber, 80 empty 45-gallon oil drums, and various foodstuffs. 5 weeks later, on November 10th, Gerald Douglas, captain of the merchant ship the Tuvalu, en route from Suva to Funafuti, sighted the Joyita more than 600 miles west from her scheduled route, drifting north of Vanua Levu. The ship was partially submerged and listing heavily, and there was no trace of any of the passengers or crew. 4 tons of cargo were also missing, and the recovery party noted that the radio was discovered tuned to 2182 kilohertz, the International Marine Radio Telephone Distress Channel. And although the Joyita was found with her bilges and lower decks flooded, her hull was sound, and when she was moored back in harbor at Suva, investigators heard the sound of water entering the vessel, and it was found that a pipe in the raw water circuit of the engine's cooling system had failed due to galvanic corrosion, allowing water into the bilges. And the first time the crew would have known about the leak was when the water rose above the engine room floorboards, by which time it would have been too late. Also, the bilge pumps were not fitted with strainers and had become clogged with debris, meaning that it would have been very difficult to pump the water out. And it is sometimes known as the Mary Celeste of the South Pacific, and has been the subject of several books and documentaries offering explanations that range from rational and conventional to supernatural and paranormal. So, some theories as to what happened. It's possible that they were intercepted, and once it was found out that what was on board, they were killed or set adrift. It's possible that this even happened after the ship started taking on water. If they did send out a distress call, it may have been that the only ones that heard it only caused them further harm. And the valuable contents of the ship, including the people on board, may have been transferred to the other ship that arrived to help them. The other possibility for the missing cargo is that they offloaded it from the ship, thinking it might help them stay afloat, and this doesn't explain why the passengers and crew would have gone missing, though. So, one theory is that Captain Miller should have been well aware of the vessel's ability to stay afloat, leading to some to speculate that Miller had died or become incapacitated for some reason. Without him to reassure the other people on board, they may have panicked when the Joyita began to flood and taken to the life rafts. However, this in and of itself would not account for the missing cargo and equipment unless the vessel had been found abandoned and her cargo removed. A friend of Miller, Captain S.B. Brown, was convinced that Miller would never have left the Joyita alive, given his knowledge of her construction, and he was aware of tension between Miller and his American first mate, Chuck Simpson, and Brown felt that Miller and Simpson's dislike of each other came to blows, and both men fell overboard or were severely injured in a struggle, and this left the vessel without an experienced seaman, and would explain why those remaining on board would panic when the ship had begun to flood. So there is a theory that the Japanese from World War II were somehow involved. The Fiji Times and Herald quoted at the time from an impeccable source to the effect that the Joyita had passed through a fleet of Japanese fishing boats during its trip and had observed something the Japanese did not want them to see. The Daily Telegraph hypothesized that some still active Japanese forces from World War II were to blame for the disappearances, operating from an isolated island base. And there was still strong anti-Japanese feeling in parts of the Pacific. And in Fiji, there was specific resentment at Japan being allowed to operate fishing fleets in local waters. Such theories suddenly gained credence when men clearing the Joyita found knives stamped "Made in Japan." However, tests on the knives proved negative, and it turned out the knives were old and broken, quite possibly left on board from when the Joyita was used for fishing in the late 1940s. There's also a mutiny hypothesis, and yeah. Which goes, author Robin Mom spent many years investigating the vessel's past and published his findings in the Joyita mystery. Mom agreed that events were started by the flooding from the broken cooling pipe and the failure of the pumps. The mattresses found covering the starboard engine were used either in an attempt to stem the leak or to protect the switchboard from spray kicked up by the engine's flywheel as the water level rose. At the same time, the Joyita encountered increasingly heavy swells and squally weather, and Miller, knowing Joyita to be unsinkable and desperate to reach his destination to clear his debt, pressed on. However, Chuck Simpson and possibly other crew members demanded that he turn back, and this effectively led to a mutiny, and Miller and the crew struggled, during which Miller sustained a serious injury. By now, the ship was entering heavier weather, with winds around 40 miles per hour, and with one engine and a flooded bilge, was beginning to labor. The flooding in the engine room would have eventually caused the starboard engine to fail, also cutting all the vessel's electrical power, and Chuck Simpson was now in control and made the decision to abandon ship, taking the navigational equipment, logbook, and supplies as well as the injured Miller with them. It still seems unlikely that Chuck Simpson would choose to abandon a flooded but floating ship to take small open rafts into the Pacific Ocean. But Mom proposed that they sighted a nearby island or reef and tried to reach it, but in the strong winds and seas, the rafts were carried out to sea, leaving the Joyita drifting and empty, and the damage to the lightly built superstructure was caused by wave damage, while the vessel was drifting in open, heavy seas. This has been your host, Luke. Like this video if you liked it. Subscribe for more. I hope you have a good night. Thanks for watching.